There is a world where money seems to be able to buy everything. One man will learn that humanity is more valuable than gold. And when fate puts him in love with someone he never thought he would, he can't help but change. At the end of his trip, Arthur Montanari will have to make a decision that will change not only his life, but also everyone else's. The first rays of sunlight touched the glass of the buildings in a city that never sleeps before the sun even reached the horizon. Arthur Montanari started his day in the middle of this maze of steel and glass. He is the owner to one of the biggest real estate fortunes in the country. He didn't care that breakfast was served on a marble table, surrounded by expensive art. It was just a background for him. He was thinking about the work that he had to do that day and choices that could cost millions, or even billions of dollars. The morning news caught Arthur's attention as he read the financial records that his helper had left next to his croissant. Pictures of a tense protest in a slum on the edge of the city were shown on the screen. Families were being moved against their will to make room for his building, a new high-end neighborhood. Arthur just watched in quiet. He didn't show any emotion in his eyes. He said to himself, "Another stone in the path of progress," and turned off the TV with a smirk. Arthur had always thought that hard work and talent were the keys to success. He had worked hard, too, or at least that's what he told himself. As the son of a business tycoon, he not only got the money, but also the cruel belief that the world was only for the strong. Arthur thought that the people who lived in the slums were weak and couldn't get out of their situation. He thought the world was fair because everyone had the same chances, and if someone couldn't take advantage of them, that wasn't their fault. Employees rushed around the table, trying not to look at their boss. Arthur finished his coffee and left for the day. There was a very important meeting with investors from other countries planned for that day, and nothing could go wrong. His house was surrounded by high walls and was always being watched. This showed that he was cut off from the hard reality that many people had to face every day. Arthur looked at his cell phone screen one last time as he got into his black vehicle with darkened windows. It was written on a notice that the slum would be torn down next week. He smiled because he was happy with how things were going. He thought of this as just another deal that went well and another step toward building up his business. Arthur wasn't aware of what was going on around him as the car drove through the busy streets and crossed the imaginary lines that divided wealth and poverty. The favelas were just points on the map that he didn't want to see, think about, or feel. His world was full of light, wealth, and power, and he wouldn't let any of these things be threatened. It was just like any other morning, and Arthur went about his day's plans according to his carefully thought-out schedule. After the meeting with the foreign investors, Arthur had once again come out on top, making a deal that would promise him huge earnings over the next few years. He felt good about having another successful day, so he drove to his farm on the coast to spend the evening in peace. The first drops of rain started to fall as the car drove along the curving road that linked the city to the coast. The driver changed the speed while paying close attention to the road, but Arthur was busy on his phone, texting his friends about the next steps in the real estate project. He couldn't see clearly because he was worried about the numbers and excited about the victory. As the rain got heavier, it formed a thick mist that made it hard to see. The sky got darker and thunder could be heard on the horizon, but Arthur was still in his bubble of power and control and didn't notice. He always saw the world through his own eyes, and it seemed like nothing, not even nature, could stop his march to victory. Right out of nowhere, a car coming the other way appeared on the road. Arthur's driver tried to turn, but it was too late because the road was wet. The night was filled with the sound of tires sliding on wet concrete and then the loud crash of metal hitting metal. When the glass broke, everything around Arthur turned into a jumble of lights and shadows. Time seemed to stop for a split second. Arthur felt the hit, but his body didn't move. It was like his body was suspended. The car went off the road and into a tree after spinning around very quickly. His lungs let out air, and he started to lose his sight as the nothingness that was slowly taking over him ate him up. When the rescuers got there, Arthur was lost and stuck in the wreckage. The driver, who was only slightly hurt, was shocked to see the relief team work to get his boss out of the wrecked car. Arthur's face was covered in blood, which mixed with the heavy rain that was still falling. The person who had always been in charge of everything was now helpless and open to fate. The mansions inside was even more amazing than Lucia had thought. The marble floors, the marble columns that rose up to the frescoed ceiling, and everything else gave off an air of luxury that she had never felt before. The maid, a stiff, well-dressed woman, greeted Lucia and led her right to the room where Arthur Montanari was being cared for. Lucia could feel the weight of her duty growing in her chest as she climbed the stairs. It was different. The air was cooler. This might have been because of the air conditioning, which kept every room at the right temperature. It was a sensible, emotionless voice that the maid used to tell Lucia what she needed to do. When they got to the bedroom, the maid gently opened the door to show them a classy room with dark colors and expensive furniture. Arthur Montanari, a guy whose name had a lot of power in the city, was in the middle, lying on a fancy bed surrounded by medical equipment. He was lying still, eyes closed, and face pale, which was very different from the pictures Lucia had seen in newspapers and magazines. When Lucia got close to the bed, she felt a little shaking. Even though she knew it was her job to take care of him, she wasn't ready to be in front of such a strong and fragile guy at the same time. For a moment, she looked at Arthur's face and tried to think what was going through his mind since he had everything and nothing at the same time. At that moment, Arthur moved a little, as if he could feel her presence. He was going back and forth between being asleep and being awake. He slowly opened his still cloudy eyes and saw Lucia's face for the first time. His face showed a mix of shock and confusion, as if the world had changed so much that he couldn't recognize it. Lucia stepped back in surprise at the sudden movement, but she quickly calmed down again. Arthur tried to talk, but his voice was so weak that it was almost impossible to hear him. She leaned in a little to hear what he was saying as she moved closer. "Who? What do you do?" Arthur said in a low voice that was full of doubt. "Hi, my name is Lucia. As promised, I will take care of you," she said, her voice soft and calm. Arthur kept staring at her, trying to figure out what was going on. What was once a world of wealth and power now seemed far away and broken up. The sight of Lucia, a person he would never have imagined seeing in private, made him think of how much things had changed. Lucia, on the other hand, felt both sorry for them and uneasy. She didn't know what to say in response to that look, which made her feel both confused and open. But she knew that her life would always be connected to his after that. She got ready for the task of caring for a man who was as far away from her as the moon is from the sun with a small nod. As Arthur was being taken to the hospital, the ambulance's noise broke the silence of the night. The outlook wasn't clear. They said it was a coma caused by serious head injuries. The news got to his partners and family quickly, and they started making plans right away for how to handle his possible short or permanent absence. Arthur was not awake, but his thought was traveling through a dark and unknown world where time didn't exist and money and power didn't matter. He had always been in charge of his life, but now he was stuck between life and death, fighting alone and in silence. In real life, people were starting to miss him. Even though the business kept running, Arthur's guidance was missing. And in the favelas where his projects were supposed to force hundreds of families to move, hearing about the accident didn't make things better. The buildings were still going to be torn down, but now they would be done by people just as cruel as he was. Arthur Montanari's life, as he knew it, had stopped while his body stayed in a hospital bed surrounded by machines that watched every beat of his heart. While he was in a deep sleep, his mind started to wander into unknown territory. There, the ghosts of the past and the unknowns of the future would start to shape the man he would become, if he ever woke up. On the other side of the city, away from the fancy hospitals and huge homes, life went on as usual. It was hard and never stopped. In a small room on the edge of town, Lucia Hernandez was awake before the sun came up. She had no break from her routine, and every morning she went to work with the hope that one day she could make things better. Lucia was a refugee who had left her home country in Central America to find safety and better chances. She crossed countries in search of a place to start over because she was running away from violence and poverty. But things were tough in her new home. Lucia had a hard time supporting her family as a maid. She sent what little money she made back home, where her mother and younger brothers were still having a hard time. As Lucia made breakfast for her son Javier, she thought about the trip that had brought her here. She remembered the long nights she spent crossing countries, the constant fear of being caught and sent back to her home country, and the pain of leaving everything behind. But most of all, Lucia remembered the promises she had made to herself. To never give up and to keep working to give Javier a better life, away from the violence she had known. Lucia was proud of her work, even though it didn't pay well and wasn't always seen as important. She saw every little thing she did as a victory, every bill paid, every meal on the table. Her strength came from her desire to get through hard times. You could see this determination in her eyes, which were always alert and looking for a new chance. Lucia looked around as she walked to the bus stop that would take her to her new job that morning. She knew these streets so well. The area around where she lived was scarred by poverty and loss, but it was also strong and tough. Kids played in the streets, street sellers yelled out their goods, and neighbors greeted each other with quick nods, showing the unity that came from having to live. When Lucia got to the Montanari house, she was both scared and determined. She knew she was going into a world that was very different from her own. In this world, wealth was normal and poverty was seen as far away and not important. She knew she would do her best, though. Being dedicated and doing good work were things that Lucia was known for. These qualities helped her get jobs even in a tough job market. In the face of such grandeur, Lucia couldn't help but feel small as she walked across the huge yard that led to the main door of the house. The statues and fountains made of marble in the yard seemed to whisper about the rich people who lived there, which was so different from where she came from. Before she knocked on the door, she took a deep breath. After that, her life would start to connect with the life of a guy she had never met, but whose fate was now tied to hers in a way that couldn't be broken. Lucia was about to come into Arthur Montanari's life, but neither of them knew how much it would change everything. The days turned into weeks, and then the weeks turned into months. During this whole time, Arthur stayed in bed and couldn't get back in charge of his life. For someone who was used to telling other people what to do and choosing their fate, being forced to rely on others was too much to bear. Arthur, who used to be strong and sure of himself, had to depend on someone else to do even the most simple things. Lucia was always there and did her work carefully and quickly. She took extra care of Arthur in a way he had never had before. Not only was she efficient, but there was also something special about how she did each job. Her adjustments to the pillows, the care with which she cleaned his face, and the skill with which she gave him water all showed care that he didn't fully understand. Over time, Arthur changed how he felt about Lucia. Before, he didn't pay much attention to her because she was just another maid who did small jobs. But now she was the only person who was always with him, and he started to notice the little things, like how tired she looked, how she smiled quietly when he could finally say something, and how she seemed to carry the world on her shoulders. Arthur had always been proud of how independent he was, but he started to feel something strange and unsettling, an inner need. He had always been in charge of everything around him, but now he was being cared for by someone who stood for everything he used to dislike or ignore. Lucia was a tough woman who had been through more bad luck in a year than he had in his whole life. That interested him. In times of peace and quiet, when Arthur was too tired and in pain to sleep, he thought about his life. He thought about the choices he had made and the deals he had made without thinking about how they would affect other people. Everywhere he looked, Lucia was there, making him doubt everything he had built. If someone so different now had all the power, was his whole life just a trick to make him feel like he had control? For her part, Lucia was also noticing how Arthur had changed. He was rough, cold, and almost cruel at first. She saw that he was changing as time went on, though. He started to listen more than he talked and ask questions. She even saw him smile a few times, which she had never thought he would do when she first met him. One day, she was moving Arthur's pillows around when he looked at her so deeply that it made her stop for a moment. Have you ever thought about how? Isn't this all unfair? What is it? He asked, his voice hoarse from working so hard to speak. Lucia stopped and looked him straight in the eye, not sure what to say. Not fair, again and again, as if to make sure she could say the word correctly. Yes, you're here taking care of me, and me here, helpless to do anything. He took a deep breath, as if it were hard for him to say. I always believed that power was everything. I don't seem to have anything now, though. Lucia thought about his question. Life puts us in situations we can't always avoid. But that doesn't mean we can't be strong even when we're weak. Arthur kept quiet as he took in what was being said. He thought for the first time that maybe there was more to life than money, power, and control, and that something else was there in Lucia's quiet presence all the time. The days went by slowly, but Arthur noticed that his healing wasn't going the same way every day. Lucia's presence turned into more than just a need. It turned into a relief. Arthur wasn't sure what it was about her calmness and the way she stood facing life with a quiet peace that touched him. On the other hand, Lucia saw the small change in Arthur. He seemed less remote and shy than before. Now he seemed more open and human. He would sometimes look out the window with a steady gaze, as if he were thinking about his whole life. His body language was less stiff, and when he spoke, his voice had a softness that it hadn't had before. He broke the quiet one day while Lucia was changing the flowers in Arthur's room. "That song. What is it?" This was about the soft tune coming from the radio that Lucia had brought with her. "It's a song from my home country," she said with a small smile. "When I was little, my mom would sing it to me. It makes me think of home." For a moment, Arthur closed his eyes and took in the music. He said, "It's beautiful. It makes you feel peaceful." His answer caught Lucia off guard. "Yes, it does. It's one of the few things I still have from that place." She paused, but when she sensed Arthur was ready to talk, she did so. "Music gives me hope where I come from. We always find a way to sing, which helps us remember that life is still beautiful, even when it seems like there's nothing left." When Arthur opened his eyes, he saw her in a deeper way. He said, "I never thought of it that way." His voice was a strange mix of sorrow and understanding. "My attention has always been on different things. Before, I never thought about what was important." Lucia could feel how his words hurt. She knew that the man she was talking to was slowly giving up his old ideas and beliefs. She said in a soft voice, "Sometimes you have to lose something to know what really matters." There was a long pause between them, but it wasn't scary. It seemed like they were both thinking about what they had just learned about themselves. Arthur became more honest with Lucia and asked about her problems, goals, and life. He was interested in what made this woman who, despite all the bad things that had happened to her, could still find beauty in music and strength in memories of home. Lucia also started to see Arthur in a new way. He wasn't just the rich man she thought of as powerful and uninterested anymore. It was hard for him to find his way in a world he was only starting to understand. And it's interesting that his weakness made him more human, more real. She was making changes to Arthur's blanket one night when he asked her a question she had been thinking about for a while. "Lucia, do you think someone can change? Really change?" She stopped and looked him straight in the eye. "I think we can all change, but the change has to come from within. If you're ready to face the truth about yourself, it's not easy, but it is doable." Arthur slowly nodded as he thought about what she said. "I'm not sure I can. I want to try, though." Lucia gave a small smile. "That's a good start." They were coming closer as they went through pain, thought, music, and getting to know each other better. Both Arthur and Lucia had no idea what was going to happen, but it was starting to change their lives in big ways. As Arthur slowly got better, the changes in how he saw things started to show up in the world around him. Friends and coworkers stopped coming to see him as often, and he learned that the people who used to be interested in him were more interested in his business than in his health. He felt even more alone because of this fact, but it also made him face things about his life that he had been avoiding for a long time. And during this time, Lucia became his steady friend, and the bond between them grew stronger. But things were getting worse in the world outside the walls of the Montanari house. People in Lucia's neighborhood started to protest when they heard that the houses were going to be torn down soon. People, who were already having a hard time, were afraid of losing what little they had. Rafael Souza, a well-known and respected leader in the slum and community organizer, was at the front of this fight. He knew a lot about the city's power structure and how decisions were made by men like Arthur Montanari, who lived alone in their ivory towers and didn't care about the results of their actions. Rafael's fight against the torn-down buildings wasn't just about housing. It was also a fight against the unfairness in society as a whole. Rafael was very dedicated to his cause and was famous for getting a lot of people to work together and for his angry speeches against the powerful. He thought that the only way to make things better was to fight for them, and that strong people would not give social justice to everyone on their own. People like Arthur were the enemy to him, because they stood for a system that needed to be destroyed. Raphael met Lucia one night after a neighborhood meeting. Not only was she worried about herself, but she was also worried about the people she knew who would have to move. Raphael, who was always paying attention, saw that she was scared and went up to her. "Lucia, we need your help. You really know these strong people and understand how they think." Raphael asked, "Maybe you can do something to help us stop this demolition?" His voice was strong but full of hope. Lucia made a choice. Even though she knew Arthur was changing, it was still hard for her to picture how she could affect the choices of a man who had been a sign of power that Raphael had worked so hard to get rid of. "Raphael? I'm not sure. Arthur, while I'm sure he's ready to hear what we have to say, he's not the same person we knew before. Also, I'm not sure if he still has the power he had before." Before the accident, things were very different, she said, her voice full of doubt. Raoul looked her in the eye and tried to understand what she said. "Lucia, now is the time to show that he has changed if he really has. We're not as close to him as you are. If there's a way to stop this unfairness, it's up to you." Lucia knew Raphael was right, but she was scared by the weight of her duty. She felt a strong bond of loyalty to Arthur, who she now saw as a guy trying to change, but she also felt responsible to her community, which was fighting to stay alive. Raphael's words kept going through her mind as she walked back to the house that night. She felt the weight of the situation on her heart and knew she had to make a tough choice soon, one that could change not only Arthur's life but also the lives of many people who trusted her. In the days that followed, Arthur's body continued to get better, but inside him, something deeper was changing. His talks with Lucia and the long hours he spent thinking about his life were changing him in ways he never thought possible. Before, his view of the world seemed clear and easy. Now, it seemed complicated, with shades and details that he had never seen. Partner visits from the company used to be comforting, but now they were painful. Arthur saw himself in them. Men who only talked about numbers, wealth, and how to control other people for their own gain. Arthur always felt like he was drowning in every meeting, no matter how short it was. It was like he was stuck in a golden cage that he had built himself. At one of these talks, things got very tense. The partners were getting antsy that Arthur hadn't made up his mind about the real estate project that would force hundreds of families to move. One of them, his voice tense with anger, said, "Arthur, we can't wait any longer. The demolitions are already planned. We have to move forward or lose a lot of money." Arthur looked at them and felt more and more uncomfortable with what he was hearing. What made sense and was needed at the time now sounded mean and cruel. He thought about Lucia, her friends, and the things she had told them. He started to think about whether his work was decent for the first time. "It's about people, not numbers," Arthur said, and the tone of his voice surprised even him. Partner guys had never heard Arthur talk like that before, and he could tell they were confused. Another partner tried to stay cool and said, "Arthur, that's what we do. You know this is what progress costs. We don't have time to be emotional." Arthur kept hearing the words, "price of progress." He had always believed in them, but now they seemed hollow and even cruel. He couldn't get his words out because his throat was getting tight. Were he really so blind to the results of his actions for so long? Arthur said to himself more than to anyone else, maybe it's time to think again about what really matters. The men he worked with had been his partners for a long time, but now they seemed like strangers, like they were from a world he was starting to reject. "Are you suggesting that we give up on the project?" one of the partners asked in shock. Arthur didn't answer right away. It was possible for him to lose his job, his money, and everything he had worked for if he made this choice. But the thought of going down the same path, killing people for money that didn't seem important to him anymore, was even worse. "I'm saying we need to find another way," he finally said, even though he wasn't sure what to say. "We must stop acting like the lives of these people don't matter. We need a way out that doesn't mean ruining the lives of hundreds of families." After that, there was a long, tense pause. They didn't know what to do next. Arthur had always been the cruel boss, But now he was threatening the very foundations of his kingdom. They knew that the accident had changed him, but they weren't ready to deal with the changes that had happened. Arthur was faced with a hard reality. He had to decide whether to keep his power and wealth or follow a new moral path, even if it meant losing everything. He knew that his choice would be the first step toward a change that would affect not only his life, but also the lives of those around him as he watched his colleagues walk away, still shocked. Afraid of what he had said at the meeting, Arthur stayed in bed that night. He had a lot of doubts. Had he made the right choice? For years, he had lived by a cruel set of rules. Make as much money as possible, grow his business, and keep his power. But now that reasoning didn't seem to make sense anymore. It wasn't linked to the real world that he had been ignoring for so long. Arthur felt the weight of a new duty as he looked out of his bedroom window at the lights of the city he had helped build. It was no longer possible for him to hide behind contracts and numbers. His mind kept going back to the stories Lucia had told him about her life, her town, and the poor people who had to deal with poverty every day. Arthur set up a new meeting for the next morning. His partners were nervously waiting for him, hoping that he would change his mind or at least come up with a way to make their losses less severe. But Arthur was set on his goal. When he walked into the meeting room, everyone was surprised by how determined he looked. He told them straight out, "We're canceling the demolition project." People looked shocked and murmured their disbelief right away. "I'm not going to put hundreds of families' lives at risk to build one more fancy condo. We need to find a different way to grow that doesn't hurt people who don't have much already." The partners said no. "Arthur, this is going to cost a lot of money. It would mean redoing months of planning and work. It's possible that we'll lose funders and market trust." Arthur didn't say anything while they talked. He let their words fill the room with sound. He was breaking away from everything he had been up to that point, so he knew it wasn't just a matter of money. He answered with a strong voice, "I know the risks and I'm willing to take them. I want to be that kind of leader now. Someone who not only builds, but also keeps people safe. So what if I lose money? That's fine, but I will no longer ignore the results of my deeds." There was a tense pause. The partners looked at each other as they tried to understand what Arthur was saying. They knew it would be pointless to try to persuade him otherwise. Arthur was determined, but this time it wasn't to make money, it was to make things right. Last but not least, the oldest and most close to Arthur partner sighed and said, "If that's what you really want, we'll figure it out. But keep in mind that the road ahead will be tough." Arthur agreed, even though he knew he would have a hard time. He was aware that he was putting his business career and his wealth at risk. He did, however, feel like he was doing something right and important for the first time in a long time. Even though Arthur's choice still had effects on the partners, things were getting worse in Lucia's neighborhood. Even with Arthur's help, the locals still didn't know that the project had been canceled. Rafael Souza, who never gave up in his fight for justice, organized a big protest that got people in the community to speak out against the planned demolitions. A huge group of people with candles and signs gathered in the streets of the slum that night. There was both fear and hope in the air. Kids clung to their parents' legs, and the elderly joined in calls of defiance that could be heard through the small streets. Rafael was in charge of the group, and his presence made everyone there feel strong and determined. Lucia was with them, and her heart was torn. Though she knew Arthur had made a choice that could affect everyone, she was scared about how it would all play out. On the other hand, seeing her community work together to fight for its right to exist made her feel strong and proud. Soon after, the cops showed up and made a solid barrier between the protests and the buildings that were going to be torn down. You could feel the stress in the air. Everyone was afraid that things could get ugly. But then something strange happened. A group of Arthur Montanari's friends and colleagues arrived at the scene. He walked to the middle of the crowd wearing simple clothes, which made people look at him with surprise and doubt. When she saw him, Lucia felt very happy. He had really come. When Raphael saw that Arthur was there, he moved toward him. "Ask yourself, why are you here?" he asked, his voice full of doubt. Arthur took a moment to look around and see the faces of people he had only recently seen as problems. He spoke out loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm here to tell you that the demolitions are off. No one will lose their homes. We'll find a way to help them that doesn't involve ruining their lives." After a moment of quiet, there were whispers of disbelief. which were quickly followed by cheers and shouts of relief. When Lucia saw Arthur, the man who had been everything she feared not long ago, she started to cry. He was now on their side and ready to give up everything for what was right. At first, the protest was a cry of defiance, but by the end, it was a celebration of a surprising win. After giving up a lot, Arthur felt like he had finally found something that money could never buy: forgiveness and peace of mind. He did this by looking at Lucia and the community he had helped to protect. People in the area were still very happy about winning the next morning. After the protest, the news that the demolitions were being put on hold quickly spread, giving people who had only known struggle and insecurity up until that point a new sense of hope. Lucia walked through the streets and watched the faces of the people she met as they looked relieved and thankful. Even though it all seemed like a dream, Arthur's presence made it clear that it was real. After the news came out, Arthur stayed in the neighborhood for a while to see how his choice affected people. As he walked with Lucia, he felt the weight of the decisions he had made, as well as a new lightness that made him feel like a load he had been bringing around with him had been lifted. Lucia looked at Arthur sideways as they walked and said, "You really did it? You kept those people safe?" Arthur paused and looked around for a while. "Long ago, I did what I should have done," he said in a tone that was both humble and thoughtful. "But Lucia, I couldn't have done it without you. You showed me something I didn't want to see." When Lucia heard those words, she felt warm inside. "I only showed you the truth that many people face every day. But you made the choice. You made the choice to change." They stopped in front of a small square where happy kids were playing. Arthur looked at the scene and thought about how he wouldn't have cared about that place before the accident. Now, it seemed like every child's laugh and smile was more important than any number in his business. He sighed and said, "I don't know what the future will be like, but I know I can't become the person I used to be. Now I want to build something new, something that really makes sense." Lucia gave him a soft look. "Arthur, you've already done the first thing, and I'm sure you'll find a much bigger reason for living if you keep going in this direction." Arthur smiled, and it might have been the first real smile he'd had in a long time. He extended his hand to Lucia, and she took it right away. There, in that small square, among the people who had fought so hard, they didn't need to say anything else. The bond they formed during their healing months had grown into something deep, stronger than the racial and social differences that had once kept them apart. The changes Arthur made to his life and work started to pay off over time. The destruction wasn't going to happen after all. Instead, new development projects were started in the community to make life better for the people who already lived there without forcing them to move. Arthur chose to put money into programs for health, education, and infrastructure. These programs gave people living on the edges of society access to resources that had seemed impossible before. Arthur's friend Lucia stayed by his side the whole time. Their trust and respect for each other grew over the months, which helped their friendship grow. Lucia's strength, resilience, and caring view of the world kept pushing Arthur to improve himself and become a more responsible leader. Lucia thought about everything that had happened one day as they walked through the neighborhood, which had changed so much. "That's funny, Arthur. I never thought we'd be here together, watching all of this happen." Arthur smiled and held her hand as they walked. "Neither did I. But I guess life finds strange ways to teach us what's important. I've learned that relationships and the lives we touch are more important than power and money." They stopped in front of a building site for a new school. Arthur had started the project with the help of Raphael and other important people in the town. The area used to be a shopping center. Now it would be a place for kids in the neighborhood to learn and hope for a better future. Lucia smiled at him and said, "You've found a new purpose." "Yes," Arthur said, looking at the school that was still being built. "And it all began when you were brave enough to show me the real world, the one I was ignoring." Lucia could feel her eyes getting wet, but they were happy tears. "Arthur, you've changed. A lot of other lives will also change because of that." Arthur hugged her and felt the love and thanks that had taken over his life. "Lucia, everything we've done here we've done together. There's still a lot more to do." Arthur and Lucia walked away hand in hand as the sun went down, sending a golden light over the newly rebuilt neighborhood. They were ready for whatever the future held for them. Together, they showed that love, understanding, and the guts to change are what give people real power. Sometimes the biggest changes happen when you least expect them to.